Well, thank you so much for coming and sharing your lunch with us. I'm very thankful to Leslie and to Michelle for inviting me here. We're going to kind of do a joint presentation, I think, both kind of chiming in. I think we could both talk for hours and are happy to speak afterwards as well. But I want to give you just kind of an overview of who child migrants are, why they're coming, what happens to them when they arrive. And so I will be fairly brief. So unaccompanied alien children are those that are under the age of 18 who have no lawful immigration status in the U.S. So they may have been here on a visa, they may have been here under some legal capacity and then lost that status, or they may be recent arrivals who never had any form of legal status visa. But at the moment of apprehension, they have no legal status, no immigration status. And no parent or legal guardian in the U.S. available to provide care and physical custody. So this is at the moment of apprehension. They're not with a customary care provider, a legal guardian. Their parents may live here. They may be coming here in order to reunify with family. But when they're apprehended, they are not in the custody of a parent or legal guardian. So statistics are really difficult with this population. I think generally with unauthorized populations, it's very difficult to track the statistics. But kind of there's a general consensus that there's about 500,000 children who migrate clandestinely to the U.S. each year. These may be children accompanied by their parents. These may be coming from across the world. But about 100,000 of those children are considered unaccompanied. So again, going back to that definition. And of the kind of 500,000 that are coming, about 50,000 are from Central America. Quite a few youth from Mexico, and we'll talk a little bit about how Mexican children are treated differently than other children from other nations. But there's about 100,000 children that are apprehended each year, either accompanied by an adult or care provider or unaccompanied. Of that 100,000, so 500,000, 100,000, historically about 8,000 of those have entered into federal custody, which is now under the Office of Refugee Resettlement. I'll talk a little bit about how that works. But we've seen that number pretty stable. I think it was about 4,000 in 2004, and it's been up to about 8,000 over the last 4 or 5 years, with the exception of 2012. In 2012, we saw what has been called a surge of unaccompanied children coming into the U.S. And of that, there's about an estimated of 25,000 unaccompanied children that are apprehended each year, or in 2012, and about half of those enter into federal custody. So you may ask, what happened to the other 12,000 that didn't end up in custody? A few things. So there is an agreement between Canada and Mexico and the U.S. called the Contiguous Territories Agreement, in which Mexican children are treated differently than other children that are apprehended. So Mexican children are deported, 48 or 72 hours from the moment of apprehension, essentially flipped across the border because they can return by bus. Now, if a Central American child or a Somali child is apprehended, it's not so easy to put them on a bus. You have to arrange a flight, you have to take them into custody, and so you see greater numbers of non-Mexican youth in immigration detention for children. And so why the surge? There's a lot of theories out there about why we're seeing this sudden influx. Some of the theories that have been floated around is that there's been a change in Mexican immigration law, so that immigration in Mexico now releases children kind of akin to the old catch and release policies that we used to have in the U.S., where children aren't detained. Previously, they were detained for 30 days and told to leave the country or deported. But now the Mexican authorities are treating them very differently. There are other theories in terms of country conditions, extreme poverty, failed corn crops in Guatemala. You see a rise in the number of Guatemalan kids over kids from other countries. Other theories are that there's been a peace accord between the cartels in Mexico, so it's actually easier to migrate through. Some other theories, what are some of the other theories?
I think those are.
Yeah, those are the key ones. Another theory is that the nonprofit sector in the U.S. has done such a good job training Border Patrol on the U.S.-Mexico border that now they understand what you're supposed to do when a child presents as unaccompanied. So one of the things, and probably won't get into it now, but one of the things that my research is looking at is the experiences of Guatemalan kids in Guatemala and how kind of their debt is structured, how much money they owe, at what interest rates. It's about 10% interest. It's about $7,500 to $10,000 to get here. So when they're deported, there are very few options to pay back that debt. That's about $500 a month in interest that they owe on that debt. So you see a lot of kids that are coming, they're deported and then they're coming right back. So there may be something there in terms of increased numbers. But I think one of the things that's interesting to me is that this isn't a new social phenomenon. We've seen kids migrate to the U.S. during slavery. We've seen displacement on Native American reservations. We've seen orchestrated refugee resettlement programs specifically for kids, for Cuban children, for Vietnamese children. This isn't a new phenomenon, but we're certainly paying much more attention to it than we ever have. And we can talk a little bit about that. Just moving on, how they arrive. Again, about 80% of the kids that are entering into federal custody are from Central America. And so train, walking, bus, a whole range. Some children are stowaways on boats. There's a Somali youth I worked with who, there was a conflict in Somalia. His parents were killed. He went to Kenya, lived in Kenya for a couple years, managed to get an uncle in the UK to send him $800, flew to Brazil, walked from Brazil to the US. About 8 months, all told, from Kenya to the US-Mexico border, went up to Border Patrol with a group of other Somalis. In the interim, he was detained in immigration detention in Mexico for a month, released, told to leave the country, continued on his journey. Arrived at the Border Patrol checkpoint station in El Paso and said, I want to seek asylum. And he was detained for a year while he sorted out his asylum case. So, you know, people migrating face all sorts of hazards, not only the cartels, the gangs, corrupt police, but also natural elements to riding on top of a train. There's a lot of amputations. There's a lot of people that lose their lives en route. And so, again, these 8,000 that we see in immigration custody are in many ways survivors. They've kind of undergone this harrowing journey and gotten here safely, but in the process have witnessed quite a bit.
That's why they call the train the beast.
Yes.
The kids will refer to it as that because of those, the danger involved in the journey.
Mm-hmm. Or the Death Express is another common term. But I do want to point out, you know, this picture on the right, these are images from Don Bartletti, who won a Pulitzer for some of the photography he did for Sonia Nazario's book called Enrique's Journey. But there is this whole community of people along the train routes through Mexico from Chiapas to the U.S.-Mexico border that offer support and shelter and solidarity with people that are, you know, that are coming to the state. So it's not all gloom and doom. It certainly is a very difficult journey, but there is kind of these entire communities of people who understand the plight of migrants. So why do they come? A number of reasons. I think the most common is to reunite with family, where, you know, children have family members that are here, been here for a few years, and they're coming to be with them. And so apprehension and detention is an interruption in their desire to be with their families. And, you know, you can kind of go down the list. I think a couple of things that are important to highlight, or that is that, you know, particularly in Guatemala and El Salvador, where I have more experience with research, is that there's a culture of migration. So your dad goes, your uncle goes, your mom goes. It's your rite of passage. And so the idea that migration is somehow pathologized or somehow a symptom of kind of a disintegrating family or some sort of abuse, yes, that's true, but it's also, you know, the cultural norm, that you come, that you seek opportunity, that you are an enterprising, resourceful person who can borrow the money, who can make this very difficult journey and get here. And so in many ways, families who come together to make the decision about who migrates, they're looking for those that speak Spanish the best. So in indigenous communities, those, you know, youth that have some education, some language ability in Spanish in order to get through Mexico, to pass themselves off as Mexican if they're apprehended, and to get here and find jobs. Many times it's males over females because the journey is so dangerous and sexual violence is so rampant. And so, you know, in many ways, families come together and decide who is the strongest and most promising and morally, you know, strong person to get here and resist all the temptations of consumerism and drugs and loud music and gangs and all these things. And so, in many ways, families are investing in their child. And so children take that very, very seriously. Just in terms of numbers, I think you'll see here it's mostly Central American. In the past couple of years, Guatemalan youth are now one of the largest communities. Mostly male, though the number of females is going up. It used to be 21, 22%. Now it's up to 25%. And the average age right now is 14.5. We've seen this come down from 16 to increasingly younger ages. So what happens? So I think in most instances when children are crossing the border, they're apprehended, identified as unaccompanied. Within 48, 72 hours, Border Patrol, ICE transfer them to the Department of Health and Human Services, Office of Refugee Resettlement, which is also responsible for resettling refugees. This shift occurred in 2003 with the reorganization of the Department of Homeland Security. It used to be that kids were detained in juvenile jails, that Immigration INS at the time was responsible for both caring for, detaining, and trying to remove children. So this was a conflict of interest, and in 2003 they separated kind of legal and custody.
In part because they were sued for such egregious violations of the rights of children. Mm-hmm. It was pretty outstanding what ICE had been doing.
Yes, absolutely. So now we have ORR, who subcontracts with nonprofit organizations across the country. And I think it's about 70, maybe more, facilities and a range of different types of facilities. So now you have civil society, in my view, detaining children. And, they're locked doors, they're not allowed to come and go, kind of their experiences in the shelter.
Well, actually, let's go back a
Sure.
slide. So I worked for 5 years at Immigration Counseling Service, which is a nonprofit in Portland, Oregon, and we were contracted to provide Know Your Rights presentations and legal screenings to the children in detention. So just to sort of bring it home to our community, we do have these facilities in Oregon. They're all in Portland. When Oregon first came on board with ORR to detain children, the children were detained at Norcor, which I don't know if anyone knows where that is, but it's the sort of maximum security prison in the Dalles, Oregon. So all of these kids who were apprehended and placed into detention were placed in the Dalles. They had immigration court in Portland, but were held in the Dalles. So if you can imagine the number of attorneys that those children had access to out in the Dalles and services, it was very, very limited. After about 3 years of having the facility in the Dalles, it was closed down, and ORR partnered with Morrison Child and Family Services in Portland, Oregon to open up new facilities. So currently in Portland, we have a shelter. Well, so I like to go from the top down. We have a staff secure facility, which is in the Donald E. Long jail in Portland that houses, if you're a kid who's convicted of murder in Portland, that's where you will be housed. So the ORR has a separate wing in that jail to house the civil violators of immigration law, these children. And then we also have a shelter and foster homes and long-term foster care, or staff secure shelter and long-term foster care. The youngest children that we've seen in detention in the Portland area are 4 years old, and they go all the way up to, right before they turn 18 years of age. So that's just to say that this is existing in our community too. It seems like something that's very abstract and out in the United States, but it's happening here in Portland. So we do have these facilities here in Oregon where these kids are being detained.
And I think the idea is that it's a less restrictive environment, and that you have staff that are trained to be care providers and have the cultural competence to work with kids from a number of different countries. But in Chicago, we have, I think, now 7 facilities, and the largest is a 250-bed facility in downtown Chicago where there's no green space. The kids don't get out. It's really a very difficult place to be. And while you're there, there are cameras, there are, regulations on your behavior. You're always monitored. You get a 20-minute phone call each week. There's pretty limited access to interpreters if you're not kind of Spanish or Mandarin speaker, or yeah, Spanish or Mandarin are the two biggest languages in Chicago. So, yeah, it's in all of our communities, but you would never notice it. So the experience in the shelters is not benign. It's really difficult for kids, and kids that have interest growing on their debts, and their families have mortgaged their land. There may be threats on their lives if they're not repaying, and kids are in immigration detention. And a lot of times, in my experience, families don't understand what immigration detention is. And so a child calls and said, I was detained. And they said, well, what did you do wrong? What crime did you commit? Did you, steal something? Did you get drunk? I mean, what is it that you did? It's some sort of moral transgression. But clearly, they were just apprehended for not having
And it's
documents.
not just the families, it's
Right.
the children themselves as well as our communities. Look at these kids as some sort of criminals because they're in these facilities that are housing criminals. But one of the major differences, because this is civil detention, is that the children aren't afforded legal counsel. And so it's a system of detaining children without necessarily access to attorneys to either dispute their detention or represent them in their removal and deportation proceedings. Because all of these kids that are in these facilities are facing deportation. So it's very much not a surprise that the children or their families think of them as being in jail, because it very much has that experience. Not all of them. Some of the facilities are with foster care families, and it's a much gentler experience, especially for the younger age children.
And so, in the facilities, attorneys are go through a similarly kind of subcontracted structure. So ORR is funding the detention facilities and the staff in the facilities, but they're also subcontracting to provide legal service providers to do the screenings in the facilities, which is great that they have that legal representation, but again, it in some ways replicates the conflict of interest that you had under INS. So I think there's kind of a general move in the country to try to move legal service providers under the Department of Justice to try to have some more autonomy, because I think that there's a lot of violations, not only in the children's rights, but also in the facilities that are not being brought to the courts, not being brought to attention, because you lose your funding. So, I think that's a whole other beast. But so, there are very few children that end up, pursuing legal relief. One of the few benevolent aspects of immigration detention for kids is that they can be released to a family member or a sponsor of some kind of family friend. So they go through this long process of filling out paperwork, providing documentation in order to receive custody of the child from detention. Their deportation and the removal proceedings is still going on, but at least they can be out in the community, they can be attending school or being with their families. But I think increasingly as we see the numbers of children going up, the requirements to release kids are going down. So when I was doing research from 2007 to 2010, the average was about 53 days. And I think that number is probably coming down. But you get both the ends of the spectrum, kids that are released in a couple of days to kids that are there for a year, 2 years, 3 years, depending on the situation.
I think the main point that I would like to convey in this is just that this is a very secret sort of population, secret in the sense that we don't see it. And it's a very vulnerable population. And so it's great that you are here today and listening and thinking about this, because this is the kind of attention that we need to draw to this problem that's going on. Kids are trying to be hidden from view. They don't want to be caught, for the most part, by Border Patrol. They don't want to be seen. They want to sort of live below the radar in the United States. And so, the added component of this is once kids are detained and they're transferred into ORR custody, they go into these facilities throughout the United States, and no one really sees them because these facilities are locked away. The kids aren't really coming out necessarily, or you see a group of kids and you don't identify what that group of kids is doing. And then the kids who are in deportation or removal proceedings, and they're going to the immigration court, and they have their selected day at immigration court where no one else is there. It's just the kids. And they get deported, and no one is really there seeing that this is happening. And so it's really important to sort of call attention to what's going on and to start asking questions about, is this really how we want to treat children that come to the United States? And is there a better way? And is there something we can do? And it just sort of in the middle of all of this, I do want to say there is something that you can do. And one of the big things that they're talking about in the Senate, I don't know if you are following comprehensive immigration reform like I am, but one of the things that they're talking about is allocating funding so that all of the children that are in removal and deportation proceedings will be appointed an attorney. So that's a really, really big deal because, like I said, you know, this 4-year-old that we have in detention in Portland doesn't have an attorney. The court completely expects this child to go to court and represent herself in the proceeding. And everyone sees that there's a problem with that. It's not like the immigration judge or the attorney for ICE is enjoying this situation. It's a huge struggle for all of us. But the problem is that people aren't aware that the problem is going on. And so there's not a lot of momentum to make something different, to give these children an access to an attorney, to give them really the legal services that they need and deserve. Because there are the protections within immigration law for these children. And Congress, people in general have recognized that these are vulnerable children that really need some extra assistance when it comes to gaining legal status in the United States. But if there isn't someone to help the kid get there, that kid isn't going to be able to apply for a trafficking visa, for asylum, for special immigrant juvenile status. You know, a 4-year-old can't do that. You can't do that, let alone a small child. You know, you could with the right help and instruction and guidance, but we need to have people there to help these children along in their way. So the Senate Comprehensive Immigration Reform, the bill that they passed, allocated funds for children to have representation, all children in OR custody to have representation in removal deportation proceedings. So hopefully you guys are from maybe different states and you have different members of the House that you can call and really say that immigration reform needs to happen, and specifically this component about providing access to legal counsel for the children that are detained.
And I would just add, and then we can maybe open it up to questions. There's a pilot project out of the University of Chicago Law School that provides guardian ad litems for children in immigration detention. It's only in Harlingen, Texas, and Chicago, but I do think that there's this awareness that there needs to be not only legal service providers, but GALs. There needs to be follow-up services. Once children leave the facilities, ORR ceases to be responsible, and they do this for a number of reasons. I think legally they don't want to be liable for children once they're released from custody, but they don't know what happens to these children, and especially on deportation or repatriation, there's no investigation into what they're going back to, why they came in the first place, is there an adult there that's able to care for them. So the kind of best practices we have in the domestic child welfare system simply do not exist in the federal system for children. And I think in many ways it's a reflection of not recognizing them as children. And so yeah.